The war is here. You know your purpose. You know your fallback plans if things go bad. Get to your positions, and your squad commanders will begin directing you to your stations.
Varric took command with ease. It'd been something Jaken had trained him to do for years. He'd spent the last 2 months training new recruits and reintegrating veterans still able to fight. He hoped it would be enough. As he walked the line of people that stood at attention, he took in the varying ages. So many young people here.
I've prepared you the best I can. These twisted humans are tortured and have their minds destroyed to make them yield to the influences of the puppeteer's will. When fighting them, they will be stronger, faster, but without the healing abilities of the shepherds. This is why I've trained you to use killing blows only. Patience against them will only wear you down and overwhelm you. One swing, one shot, one kill. Furthermore, it is likely that Jaken will be bringing his best to fight here. Shepherds who've spent as long as he has in this war. You must not face them. One of us can take on about 8 of you in close quarters with no risk of losing. It will be a slaughter if you try. So don't. Leave them to us.
Sir, do you know what we need to look for?
That's a tough guess. But there are at least 5, and I know of who will be there for sure. The puppeteer will be one, of course. But he will be the furthest from the battle. There are 3 Jaken likes to use on the front lines. One is called Sight. He reflects light to make himself invisible. This environment will be perfect for him. The second is called Helix, and she has the ability to recompose any molecule into deadly poison or even generate a plague. She must do this by touch, so she can be avoided and should be at all costs. She's stronger and faster than you, but she's not as gifted in combat. The third is called Golem. His ability is to animate objects. He does this through possession, becoming a spirit of sorts, and then transforming a tree or rock or other such thing into a living weapon. This is the one Byron is battling now.
For a moment, Varric's mind drifted to his young charge, and for the first time he wished he was at the boy's side to protect him.
This is writer-director Joshua Kasperek, and you're listening to Shepherd, Journey of the Time Walker.
It had become a dance for Prince Byron, using his sword to slash away at the twisted humans as they attacked him, easily dodging the thunderous attacks of the stone golem. The dance was easy to follow. Slash, slash, duck, and roll away from the golem's blow. Slash, slash, duck, and roll away from another blow. He had slashed away at the twisted humans, killing in one blow as instructed. Since they were not armed, Byron found his lack of swordsmanship was not a problem. Byron let his thoughts fall away into the flow and stride of combat, intently focused as the last few twisted fell at his feet. He rolled away from another blow once again. This time, though, he came up out of the roll and turned to face his opponent as he slid his sword back into its sheath. He'd fought with his back to this giant enemy almost the entire time since he'd dropped from Tyrus's leg and started this attack. Byron used the feel of the bitter cold air to gauge this monster's attacks. Unlike the tree form, this one was much slower. It was too heavy to keep up with Byron's moves. Sure, it was a powerful weapon, but you can't hurt what you can't catch. Every time the beast swung, it was like an announcement of its intentions. Byron smiled menacingly.
This is gonna be fun.
Byron used a short burst of speed to close the distance between him and his target. Despite the snow and risk of slipping, he was careful with his steps as he slowed, now mere inches away from this golem. Byron instantly realized that this version wasn't as tall as the previous tree form it had taken. This amused him for some reason. His thoughts, however, turned to the matter at hand as the being began to bring another blow toward him. Byron easily dodged it and, like before, attempted to use a powerful blow to bring it to its knees. After dodging another blow, he accomplished a better position. Byron swung a kick as hard as he could at the inside of the monster's knee. It did force him down, but Byron broke his own ankle in the process. Though his healing began immediately in his heightened state, if the monster attacked, Byron was a sitting duck. He clenched his teeth. The pain wasn't as bad as when he'd nearly had his arm ripped in half, but it was enough for a distraction. He lost focus, then barely threw himself back as a fist whizzed past his face. This wasn't fun at all. Byron felt the muscles pull tense around the newly mended bone in his right ankle, and put 100% back into his focus on the battle. The creature was still kneeling. Byron wasn't sure why it was taking so long for the monster to act. Rather than wait, Byron ran and then dropped, sliding in the snow, until he was directly under the monster's crotch. Twisting his legs under him, Byron stood fast, and with every ounce of strength he had, pushed against it. Byron had a sudden and horrible thought that this stone creature may still have genitalia. He shook that thought away and continued to push. Finally, the rock golem fell hard into the snow, its head turned to the side. Byron quickly reacted by jumping up onto the rear and running up to the head. Despite the chaos of the battle, he had seen the jewel once again in the center of the head. He didn't know why, but Byron suspected this is what housed the shepherd when he possessed these objects. When he closed in, he smiled when a man's fearful face showed as a reflection in the polished jewel set firmly in the giant's forehead.
This is R.C. Anthus, and you're listening to Shepherd, Journey of the Time Walker.
I can't believe you did that! I told you not to let him out of your sight! Benjamin Hayne and Tyrus Clade had spent the last 20 minutes arguing about Tyrus having left Byron behind to bring back a report. Despite Tyrus's indignation and strong objections to Benjamin's attacks, they continued to fight even while he and Ben flew over the middle of the fray. A little too low for Tyrus's liking. He felt himself giving in to panic even as he gave a measured, even tone in response to his friend.
Calm down, Benjamin. I don't need this right now.
This is where you and I will part ways. I'm going to start clearing a path. Go back and work with Roan on the third phase of the plan.
You seem awfully sure we're going to need the third part of this plan.
Ben's features turned dark, and his eyes became distant. This is it, Tyrus. This is where I die. Ben had told him everything about his prophetic, reoccurring dream. The destiny he felt was lined up for his brother Byron. He'd even tried to explain to Tyrus his own role in that future. Tyrus didn't question it. He'd been through too much with Ben already. He simply accepted the statement as it was meant, a plea for them to part ways peacefully. Tyrus nodded his understanding of what Ben was asking him to do, to leave. Let him go on this path alone. Finding a place to set down alongside the battle, but far enough away to allow for a surprise attack, Tyrus and Benjamin parted on those last words. He made his way back to Fort William to help set the tactical retreat into its beginning paces. That was Part 3. Part 1 was to counter the attack, eliminate as many forces as possible in the front. The second part was to flank and divide their opponents. This was handled by Ben, Elizabeth, Byron, and Varric. The second part was the best chance they'd have to retreat. The information Tyrus gathered and Ben verified on their flight out was that they were outnumbered. Jaken had about 500 troops while they had about 200 mostly inexperienced recruits. They also only had 4 shepherds, and Varric didn't necessarily count as he wasn't one by birth. Tactical retreat was their best chance. Ben knew that, and so he sat down in the snow. Nothing was hiding him, yet the enemy was oblivious to his presence. He watched as the Twisted slowly passed by. The first clashes would start soon. Ben closed his eyes.
This is Diana Corona, and you're listening to Shepherd, Journey of the Time Walker.
Byron made his way back toward the gate to greet the oncoming fighters from Fort William and lead them in battle. He didn't see Elizabeth, which disappointed him. She must have been lagging behind, he figured. He turned his attention back to the oncoming Twisted army about 10 men across and many more deep. Byron thought back to his master and how she had fought them. He blew out his breath in an attempt to calm himself. Soldiers from the fort settled in beside him, and without acknowledging them in any other form lest he break his concentration, he asked the soldier next to him.
Are you ready?
We're ready when you are, sir.
Good. Follow my lead. 1 swing, 1 shot.
1 kill.
Okay, let's go.
Byron called out the words, but didn't wait for the response from the soldiers behind him. Instead, he launched into his own attack. Coordination be damned. Cass would not have been pleased. Rather than use his sword, which was too long for this kind of close combat, Byron decided to use his fists and feet. Cass had taught him to use those, and it seemed only right that he punish these beasts with them. For her. Byron began breaking faces, arms, and legs. Every catastrophic injury meant the Twisted became impossible to command by the puppeteer. They were fodder to Byron. Even as he heard the difficulties of the clashes around him, he felt unstoppable. Byron's fists and feet easily tore through flesh and bone. As the battle unfolded, he took less and less of its complexities in, such as the success of his allies. Byron Hayne had become a machine of devastation, leaving nearly 40 injured Twisted in his wake before finally taking in the result. Byron looked around for a struggling group, someone to help. He stopped his scanning suddenly when he saw a particular spear show up in his vision.
Roan, what the hell are you doing out here?
Roan wasn't struggling, far from it. His spear allowed him to create a wedge of space between him and the enemy. Byron came up next to him and Roan didn't have to ask. He could tell Byron was pissed.
You're supposed to be helping Tyrus with a tactical retreat.
Byron punched a Twisted square in the face, breaking its nose and shattering teeth.
You can't make a decision like that. It endangers the mission.
What mission?
I don't know if you know this, but we're outnumbered almost 3-1. This isn't a party, Roan.
You're the stuffiest kid I know.
Maybe.
You...
Byron snapped his attention in Roan's direction suddenly, and by reflex broke the arm of the Twisted that was choking him. Roan worked free of the now limp arm, coughing violently as he did so.
Sorry, I got careless.
I don't have time to babysit.
Hello, boys.
Oh.
Byron was startled by the sudden appearance of one of Jaken's shepherds. They wore uniforms separate from the Twisted humans around them. Byron didn't even have time to wonder why. Instead, he only had time to push Roan from harm's way before he was cut by this woman's long, claw-like fingernails. Byron absorbed the blow himself, feeling the harsh scratch open his neck. He grabbed at his neck, and a bit of blood smeared onto his gloves, but he felt no wound. He guessed it must have healed over as he moved back several steps to reassess the situation. Her scratch hadn't felt like more than a bite of a bug, but he knew who she was. Roan scrambled up beside his friend.
Run.
No.
Roan, this isn't a fight you can...
Byron cut himself off in frustration, realizing he was now dividing his attention between Roan and his opponent. He was well aware of the danger. Helix, for her part, a slightly larger woman with short gray blonde hair, stood watching them until Byron focused an angry gaze in her direction. She uncrossed her arms and then attacked with a flurry of fists. Byron blocked them, but it wasn't easy. Byron knew he was outclassed by her. She had much more experience. The blows were not designed to harm, but to test or trap one's opponent. Cass had done this to him on many occasions, and he eventually mastered how to control the process. However, that was with perfect focus. He did not have that while worrying about Roan. Byron's body began to twitch with overuse. He felt his muscles threaten rebellion as he tried to stay on top of countering Helix's attacks. Roan did as instructed, firing a specially made flaming arrow that glowed bright blue. This would bring Tyrus to him, and they would begin attacking small, weak areas in the front while Ben started the flanking maneuver. With the arrow fired, Roan brought his eyes back to the battle in front of him. The Twisted had receded from them, leaving only Roan, Byron, and Helix battling it out.
I'll give you this, lady. You know how to fight.
And you know how to die.
Come on now, that's not fair. I'm doing a little better than that.
Are you?
Byron didn't have a chance to retort. He was hit suddenly with very particular blows to the knees, chest, and side of his head. The next thing he saw as things came back into focus was Roan. Helix's arm was around his neck, holding him up and strangling him like a noose. Roan fired an arrow and Helix's arm went slack. It all happened in the spaces of seconds, but to Byron it had felt like minutes. He coughed.
What the hell, Roan?
What? No, thanks, Roan, for saving me?
I meant shooting her so late.
Now you're questioning my timing.
Oh my god!
Byron looked over at Helix. She wasn't dead. There were very few ways to kill a shepherd. Byron drew his sword and cut off Helix's head. The body lay in perfect order, and from a distance the cut was so clean the head looked like it might still be attached. Byron watched fascinated as the snow absorbed the blood. He let his mind drift back to the men he'd encountered in the forest, the blood, the wounds, the chaos. He must have drifted off for a little bit, because Roan grasped his shoulder out of nowhere.
What?
You were gone, Byron. Where did you go?
Before Byron could answer, Tyrus Clade appeared, descending from the sky, using a screech to attempt to intimidate the drones nearest to them.
Are you going to be alright?
Yeah, I'll be fine.
Byron didn't watch Roan and Tyrus take off, instead shaking loose the cobwebs and looking for the next place to help out with this battle. He at last found it after several sweeps of the chaos. Fighting some 50 yards away to his left was Elizabeth Oren.
Bingo.
This is Arkneo Masato, and you're listening to Shepherd, Journey of the Time Walker.
Elizabeth was in the perfect zone as she wielded her crescent daggers to slash at her enemies. Ben had expressed concern about her being in a large-scale combat like this, but she insisted she could handle it. She felt pride that she had been correct. Despite the chaos, Elizabeth found that it was nearly effortless to counter and kill the enemy. They didn't exactly work in unison, and so the potential of getting overwhelmed was unlikely.
Hey, need a hand?
Nope.
Oh, sorry. I meant, need an eye?
A blind joke. Yay.
Let's face it, I'm terrible without my bad jokes.
That's true. You're pretty quiet without your lame jokes.
Byron and Elizabeth continued fighting in silence for a couple of minutes. The line began to crack, and then a light erupted in the sky from Roan, who was riding Tyrus's back.
That's the second signal. Varric must be on the way.
What was the other for?
Oh, you could, it was meant as a countdown.
Look out!
Elizabeth slammed the side of her body into Byron, forcing him down. Byron was stunned by the blow as much as hitting the snow-covered ground. Byron looked up from a sitting position as he regained his senses and prepared to demand answers.
What the hell?
Elizabeth was frozen in place, her dagger in the air.
What's going on?
Byron stood and saw a bit of distortion in his vision. He tried to shake it loose.
This guy almost stabbed you.
Huh?
Byron would have thought himself crazy had it not been for Varric's intel. This was obviously the shepherd who could make himself and objects with which he kept constant contact invisible.
Well, here's a twist. This is the invisible dude. I can't see anything.
The man in Elizabeth's vision stepped back in fear.
Well then.
Byron watched as a smirk crossed Elizabeth's face.
You should probably leave this to me. I can see him perfectly.
You sure you got it?
Yes, you need to catch up with Varric anyway.
You're right. Are you set for your part when Roan sends the last signal?
I'm ready. And Byron?
She waited for him to turn as he caught his name.
Be safe.
Elizabeth couldn't put her finger on it, but something was off with Byron. It was physical, of that she was sure, but he didn't seem to be wounded. She shook the thought off as she watched Byron leave her vision and turned her full attention to Sight. A smile broke across Elizabeth's face.
Your name is Sight, isn't it? Well, since I have you at a disadvantage, perhaps you'd like to go first. Unless you're scared to fight a woman.
The goad was intentional, and the man named Sight obliged her with a slash attempt with his own dagger.
Good.
The fight was chaos versus patience as Elizabeth easily countered Sight's strikes. He clearly didn't keep up in his combat, at least she thought so. She waited. Being a blind thief, she'd learned to master patience long ago. Waiting for her moment to counter, fighting Sight was almost a pleasure to her. There. The thought jolted her body into full action. A few kicks put Sight off balance, and Elizabeth cursed as her follow-up dagger slashes missed him. He was too slow to adapt. Elizabeth closed the distance until she was a half step from him, and then she held up both of her crescent daggers. Sight held up a single straight dagger. Sight lunged forward, and Elizabeth easily moved out of the way of his dagger by ducking down. Then she lunged up, forcing him to leap backward. Elizabeth had an idea. She noticed the Twisted were starting to break through the front lines, so she had to work fast. She lunged with a slash at his neck, and then ducked again. The distraction worked, as Sight hesitated just long enough for Elizabeth to slap him on the side of the face and engage her powers to disrupt his brainwaves. He staggered back and almost fell, retching violently, his head down, his knees bent.
Well, well.
She started to approach him, trading her dagger from her left to her right hand.
Gotcha.
This is R.C. Anthus, and you're listening to Shepherd, Journey of the Time Walker.
Ben's head snapped towards the sky as the loud boom signaled them that Phase 3 had begun. Elizabeth was now preparing to use her sensory shockwave to disrupt the Twisted soldiers, as the humans had already begun a disciplined retreat behind her. They had battled and bled Jaken's forces down to slightly over half of his troops. A hard push through Fort William would no longer be an option. Ben knew Varric and Byron were on the way. He sighed heavily as he took in the chaos surrounding him. Bodies of the dead Twisted strewn in every direction. And he was about to come face to face with his destiny. He inhaled and looked for the next conflict. Varric's tension only grew with the anticipation of the impending clash. He swung his short swords in defiance of this feeling. They needed to push through. They had to make sure that Jaken would have no more ability to pursue this course, at least for a while. Varric had been right, though. Jaken wasn't in the mood to wait for his revenge. Even if it had meant a better advantage, more soldiers or whatever else, Jaken was hell-bent on doing this now.
You told me you could do this.
Jaken's hands were on each side of the puppeteer's uniform collar, lifting him up.
I did. We didn't expect so many of our kind here. Even you didn't expect to see your son. You didn't make me aware of your worthlessness against shepherds, Darren. You know damn well who their leader is. It didn't... It would... Please...
Jaken dropped him on the ground as he focused on someone who had just appeared about 10 feet in front of him, almost as if from nowhere.
And who the hell are you?
Benjamin Hain. My father is William Hain. Jaken's smile was as disingenuous as his mocking laughter.
Yes, I heard he had sons. I didn't know he would send them after me, instead of facing me himself.
Ben closed his eyes and steeled his resolve. This is where I die. Ben had carried the weight of this moment as he usurped his slumber, permeating his dreams with terror night after night. For the past 15 years, his nightmares had felt so real. Now the time had come and he found none of it felt real at all. Ben's killing of the Twisted for the last several minutes felt hollow. Was he dreaming again? Would he wake up in a cold sweat, only to revisit this precise moment in tortured nightmares the next night? Ben stepped forward, drawing his dagger. Jaken looked amused. The puppeteer was still on the ground, straining to control what was left of the army of the Twisted. Ben closed the distance between Jaken and himself, never taking his eyes off the man's face. He shared his black hair, but that's where the similarities ended. He did find it a little bit funny when he realized Jaken was shorter than him by a few inches. Ben didn't know how to start, but rather than waiting for Jaken to make the first move, he took the initiative.
Well, it does feel odd to say, but it's good to finally meet you.
Jaken looked at him a bit confused while easily dodging the slash of Ben's dagger.
You see, for years I've dreamt of this precise moment. The years spent training and preparation for our impending battle has shaped my entire life. I should have guessed it was you, really.
Jaken suddenly reached out a hand and disarmed Ben by grabbing his wrist and putting pressure on the bones, forcing the hand open. Once he'd accomplished his goal, Jaken used the back of his other hand to hit Ben across the face. Then, as if it didn't matter, Jaken let him go. Ben stumbled back a little bit, caught himself and ran his fingers across his lips to check for blood.
Okay.
It shocked Ben how easy it was for Jaken to dismiss him. It shouldn't have come as a shock at all, but it did. Ben knew he was at a disadvantage. Being unable to use his powers left him vulnerable. However, his father William made it very clear. Jaken didn't just wield power to reset things within reality. He could replicate someone else's powers, or an approximation, as long as he could witness them being used.
Such vengeance in your eyes. Funny, if you'd been more patient, this battle could have gone better for you.
Ben lunged at Jaken with his fists, nearly losing his balance. Jaken dismissed the blows easily. Ben tried again and again, yet his efforts were thwarted every time. Jaken seemed bored by the encounter.
Do you honestly think you can win with your limited... How old are you?
25 years old.
Do you really think you of all people can beat me? I, who have had 2 centuries of battle experience.
My father did.
Yes, well, he didn't really, and you won't either.
Ben reeled from a punch from Jaken. He was stronger than Ben anticipated.
I didn't come here to stop you.
Ben unloaded with a flurry of quick blows designed to force distance between himself and Jaken.
Oh, really? Then, what is it you came here for?
To delay you. My task and my capacity has never been to beat you. No matter how hard I may have tried to see you at my feet, I can only delay you here.
How will you do that when you're all by yourself,
Ben hadn't even been able to mount a defense. The blows were so hard that if he had blocked the first, it would have put him so off balance the other 2 would have landed flush. His face began to ache and his vision blurred. He felt completely useless. The thought began to eat away at the feeling that this wasn't real. Fear began to move through Benjamin Hain.
He's not by himself.
Ben heard the footsteps first, but when his brother Byron's voice broke through the haze in his eyes, Ben felt his heart sink.
This is where I die. Byron, what are you doing here?
Varric sent me ahead while he cleaned up some Twisted and helped decoy for the retreat. He was concerned about you fighting Jaken by yourself, and it appears he wasn't wrong.
No, you shouldn't be here!
A 2-for-1 special? Both William Haynes' boys have come to stop me? Well, now I can take both your heads to him.
Ben lunged at Jaken, and his blows were even less effective than before. Jaken easily countered, Ben striking Ben in the ribs with kicks. He finally ended with a back fist across the jaw. Jaken watched Ben fall to the ground on his hind end with a measure of superiority and satisfaction mixed together.
Hey, you must be Jaken. I assume you like picking on people smaller than you. I'm smaller than you. Perhaps you'd like to try picking on me.
Byron used a burst of speed, but his body resisted him. Even his attempt to strengthen his muscles was not working. He struck Jaken, full on, shoulder to the chest to force him away from Ben. However, he couldn't follow up. He was breathing too hard. He couldn't catch his breath and his skin was soaked with sweat.
Are you alright, Benji?
Ben was frozen in place, not from fear, but an inability to make a decision. The problem, he discovered, was his own participation in these events was unknown to him. For the first time in his life, he didn't know what was coming.
I'll take care of this.
Ben could hear in Byron's voice that he was hurt or somehow impaired. He still didn't know what to do. He looked up as he got to his knees, the pain still sharp in his ribs.
Well, that was interesting.
Jaken walked back toward them. Byron's blow had actually blown him back, and as he hit the ground, he carved quite the path through the snow. He'd even rolled a few times. The impact had an unexpected punch. Jaken smiled.
No, this is wrong.
Ben was still trying to get to his feet when Byron charged headlong into his second exchange with Jaken. However, his powers didn't respond, and so as he closed the distance, his attempt ended in a feeble attack. There was no holding back now. He had already committed. To say the attack was weak would mean he'd even been able to attempt a meaningful strike. He could have let him fall, but instead Jaken grabbed his arm, and in 3 easy motions he kicked the young prince in the midsection, and then in the head, twisting the boy's arm behind his back and forcing him to kneel, facing Ben.
No! Stop! No more!
The desperation in Ben's voice was punctuated by the pain in his ribs, and that was it. In a single moment, Ben had made his decision. Unleashing his time power the way he had just a short time earlier in a snowball fight with Byron, he was now going to use it to save his life. Benjamin knew he didn't have much power left. He'd spent too much time trying to change this moment in the last few months. He felt his body resist and his heart began to struggle. His vision became a bit foggy. He had to work fast. To Ben, everything was frozen, and so he rescued his brother easily. It wasn't as if people were statues who couldn't be moved, and he was glad of that. Otherwise, wresting Jaken's hand off of his brother's forearm would have been impossible. Ben brought Byron to his chest and relaxed a little, clearing his thoughts and making a few decisions. Taking off some of the furs he had on, he made a place for Byron to lie safely on the ground until Varric or Tyrus got there. He hoped it would be Tyrus. Next, he had to apologize.
Byron, I'm sorry for everything. Keeping you at a distance, cutting you out of my life for the last 5 years. I thought it would be easier if you didn't know. There's so many regrets where you were concerned, and there are so many things I wish I could endure for you. However, baby brother, this is where I die. You'll be angry with me for not trusting you. You'll be angry with yourself. I just hope it's a short space of time. You're meant to beat Jaken. I'm certain of this. You're sick. You need to focus on healing. Leave this battle behind. It was never yours.
Ben leaned down on his hands and knees where his brother lay and kissed him on the temple.
It was mine.
His healing had finally relieved the pain in his ribs. Turning to Jaken, he took in a deep breath.
Now, if I'm going to die here, I'd like to know why.
Jaken was still frozen in place, and Ben closed the distance with aggressive steps. When he was nearly nose to nose with his father's old enemy, he grabbed him around the neck.
Now, show me why.
Ben hoped it would only take a few minutes to walk Jaken's timeline, and that once he was inside it, what he saw would show him the man's destiny, or at least the fate of his coming battle with Byron. He focused on Byron as he continued sifting through Jaken's timeline.
Show me!
Ben stared downward at Jaken, who still looked down as if he had Byron by the arm. Ben tried to catch his eyes. He would wait as long as he had to. Benjamin Hayne had to know if he was right. It was a hell of a time to question now, but this was as good a time as any. Suddenly, like a searing fire, the vision came, like always from the point of view of the person he was reading. However, something was wrong. Jaken was staggering and had some blood on his hands.
You don't understand. You have to let me save his life.
Ben was concentrating hard to hold the vision. Jaken walked up to a group, but Ben couldn't make them out. He didn't try to. There was a body on the ground. Jaken knelt.
Please, you have to let me do this.
Ben didn't even hear the words this time. The body laying in front of him, obviously gravely wounded, was Byron. He heard the desperation in Jaken's voice as he and Ben looked down on his injured younger brother. He felt helplessness seep into him. There was no time to try to fix this. Ben couldn't breathe. He snapped back to reality, releasing his grip around Jaken's neck. Drawing in his time powers, he began to laugh.
This is absurd! What does that even mean? That's cruel of you!
Ben spoke to the air, but hoped the man he knew as the First was listening.
I don't know how you could have hidden this outcome from me.
Ben smashed his hands into the sides of his head to attempt to stabilize his thoughts by force.
All this? And that's how it ends? Are you kidding?
Equally as distressed beside him a few steps away was Jaken. He reached up his hand to his throat, having the oddest sensation that someone's hand had just been around it. As he surveyed the battlefield, Jaken noticed the significant changes, such as Byron no longer being in his grip, and Benjamin looking increasingly distressed.
What did you do to me?
Ben didn't acknowledge him, and Jaken had just about had enough. He quietly approached Ben and in a quick motion grabbed his arm and hit it above the elbow with the other hand. Jaken heard it break, and Ben tried to shrink away, but the hand held him in place. Jaken hit him with a kick, and then left Ben to crumple in the ground, landing on his face, his blood staining the snow. Jaken thought of his next move. Benjamin stood up using all of his strength. He knew his upper arm was broken, and judged from the pain coursing through his chest that several of his ribs were broken. He had the oddest feeling, even with the racking pain, he wanted to laugh. He knew if he did it would hurt and probably puncture his lungs, but he couldn't help it. Ben had barely even been a challenge for the man opposite him. He finally couldn't fight it anymore, and he did laugh. This made him stumble back and sit on the ground, the jolt causing more pain and a further rush of blood from his mouth, his chin soaked in its momentary warmth. Jaken looked at them slightly confused by the conflicting reactions.
I can control time.
What?
Well, not exactly. I could bring a certain amount of space to a standstill. That's how I did it.
Well, that's an interesting power. Perhaps I shall try it.
Oh, no. You won't do that. I'll have another ability you will want.
Ben stood up again. While his mind was distracted by the pain of the effort, Jaken had gone toward Byron and drawn the boy's sword from its sheath. Jaken was curious about Ben's words. What power could he possibly want more than time itself? He was definitely intrigued.
I call myself a time walker. I have the ability to walk anyone's timeline by creating a physical contact for a brief period of, well, time.
Ben smiled weakly.
I can see you don't believe me. But I have proof, and you'll be desperate to know your fate.
Ben reached his one good arm out and grabbed Jaken's shoulder.
I know your name. Your real name. I also know the darkest secret you keep from everyone you lead.
Ben leaned in and whispered in his ear. Jaken was frozen with anticipation or fear, Ben couldn't tell which. When he pulled away, Ben smiled a cruel smile, punctuated by blood.
For 15 years, I've seen this in my dreams. It's haunted me, followed me. I've tried to make sense of it, but this is it, right here. My vengeance is to trap you in pursuit of your own fate. Guess what? I don't think you'll ever figure it out. And if you do, when you see what I've seen...
Benjamin Hayne didn't have a chance to finish. As his brother's blade drove deep into his gut, he lurched a bit as his body struggled with the new pains he felt. The blade twisted and his vision disappeared. The last words he heard were of his little brother, now conscious, screaming out his name. Ben wished he could have answered his brother, but he never had time to form the words as his body went limp upon the blade. Jaken turned toward where Byron Hayne lay paralyzed by grief.
I don't usually kill children. At least, not directly.
Jaken withdrew the blade from Benjamin's lifeless body.
But in your case, I'll make the rarest of exceptions.
Byron couldn't even struggle as Jaken walked toward him, paralyzed by fear, grief, perhaps even the illness that grabbed at his senses.
I wonder what it'll be like when I give William his sons' heads before I kill him.
Byron screwed his eyes shut, and the few tears he had left in him fell silently into the blood-drenched snow.
I'm afraid I can't let you do that, Father. I am the boy's bodyguard, after all.